Okay, for people joining this live stream, this is talking about Wolfram language design, specifically submitting batch external jobs. Boy, I could have used this just last night. I probably should have done. Okay, so let's get some kind of okay. So batch submit, as opposed to remote. I mean, how does batch submit? Can we imagine batch submit working on a local machine at some point?
Not usefully. The only embedding of that makes sense is the Kubernetes idea, having batch submit work with a Kubernetes cluster, but where it's a one machine cluster and the only machine is your local machine. And I mean, it would work, but it would not be substantially different from working on a remote cluster.
So just get me a sense of this, because I'm routinely using, on my machines, I'm routinely saying, let me give you a workflow thing. So I say, whatever it is, parallel evaluate process ID or something. I've got lots of parallel kernels, right? But what I do normally is I just say, parallel table or something like this, and then I've blocked my master kernel.
Right.
Something. So do I have any choice about that?
In using parallel submission, like or parallel evaluate? I mean, that's a question for Roman, but I don't think so.
Roman? I mean, if I said like local submit of parallel evaluate, would that work?
I don't think so, since local submit runs in a subkernel and subkernels can't launch other subkernels.
Is Roman here?
He is, I believe.
Roman? I thought Roman was here.
He might be having trouble with his audio. I'll check on him.
Okay. He says he's here. So, okay, but so is there any, okay, well, why can't a subkernel launch kernels?
That's definitely a question for Roman.
Okay, but I mean, this use case is the one that I'm interested in. That is the batch submission. It's like, I've got lots of local machines. I want to just submit something. I mean, what's the best way to have this work?
On local machines, it's the Kubernetes route, which would be a Kubernetes remote submission provider for batch submit, or batch submission provider, whatever you decide to call it.
That would then be able to have a bunch of subkernels that could support parallelism. Is that right?
Not subkernels, full kernels that support parallel subkernels, or it would work best using what was called remote map submit, which now will probably be called batch map submit, which creates multiple jobs. It chunks up an input list. It's like map or parallel map, but it chunks up the input list and creates a job for each chunk. And then within each job, it uses map or parallel map to evaluate over that that chunk.
Okay, here's my naming issue. I really feel, I know it's long, but I really feel that this should be remote batch submit, because it's really one of the remote family of functions. So I'm saying, I mean, in other words, somebody says, what can I do on a remote machine? Oh, you've got remote this, you've got remote evaluate, you've got remote whatever. This fits with those.
Can you hear me now?
Well, you're a bit faint, Roman.
Okay, let me try.
No. Now you're better. Now you're sounding more assertive and you're better.
No, sometimes there's a problem that even though volume should be up, there's absolutely zero. So I'm sorry that happened at the worst possible time. So now in terms of submitting parallel jobs, I mean, all the local submission within the same thread of the same master kernel doesn't work. What does work is submitting individual parallel jobs rather than using something like parallel map. And so there's a parallel submit and wait next paradigm, which does not tie up the master kernel.
But does it start evaluating when you do parallel submit or only when you do the wait?
No, you need to. There's no background scheduler. That's something that is probably now doable, but at the time when
that
this
is a
was
very
designed,
that output blob is very weird looking for modern times. I mean, it's quite beautiful, but it's very weird. And so what do I do to actually get this thing run?
Okay, so yes, you say wait all of %.
Okay, but so what is it doing right now? I mean, what did it didn't?
I mean, it does when you it does submit the first job, and then but when the first generation of jobs are done on the parallel kernels, you have to trigger another run through the service loop. So typically, of course, you would submit a whole bunch of these, and then you have two choices: wait all, as you have done here, which blocks until everything is done, or wait next, which just blocks until the first job returns. And then you can decide whether you want to continue or to abandon the rest of the jobs.
Let me tell you the workflow that I want.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So my very typical workflow is I'm running interactively. I want to do a big computation, which I would otherwise leave running overnight. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Or so what I will often do is I will create a different local kernel and I will run it in some notebook that's connected to a different local kernel, and then I'll run it with parallel kernels connected to that different local kernel. But what I would like to do is somehow just launch that big computation and forget about it and wait for it to notify me that it's done.
Okay, yeah, that's more like a submit
more like batch
of parallel.
submission.
Yes, I mean batch submit of parallel something, right?
Right. I think something important to establish is that there's no current paradigm of parallel computation using the parallel X functions that lets you submit something that runs disconnected from the master kernel. That master kernel has to stay running. If it dies, then you've lost your connections to the subkernels.
Which is probably just as well. I mean, I have these weird programs to kill rogue kernels because they sometimes go rogue. When the master kernel dies, the subkernels don't die.
Yes, I mean they need to read or try to read or write to their parent link to notice that it's gone away. And so if they are in a tight loop, then there's no way they would notice that they should die.
Right. But
probably should have some tools, at least in the function repository, for killing rogue kernels.
Yes, I mean the one way to do it is to use the more modern versions of SSH, which and to keep the connection open. At the moment, the SSH is only used to launch the kernel, and then everything goes through the MassLink connection. But in the future, we could leave the SSH connection open, and then to kill the kernel, you would simply terminate that connection, and that would then could kill all the processes on the remote end.
Sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Stephen, for your workflow, it sounds like what you need is something like RemoteSubmit, where you basically calling remote evaluate. That remote kernel is the master kernel for the parallel computation, and you just don't want to wait until it finishes. So you need a remote evaluate that is asynchronous, and that would be RemoteSubmit, presumably.
Do we have RemoteSubmit?
Well, that's what this was called.
No, but we don't have the thing that I just mentioned. The sort of no batch logic, nothing like that. Just the analog of it's just remote evaluate done asynchronously.
Now
I don't have that.
Okay, let's go ahead.
I want to mention that RemoteSubmit/batch submit, whatever we call it, is topologically similar to that in that it is relying on something else that is not the master kernel to be keeping track of these of the one or multiple jobs that have been launched. And in the case of AWS Batch, that thing is the AWS Batch job scheduler, which is provided by AWS. In Charity Engine's job scheduler. In Kubernetes, it is Kubernetes, the Kubernetes scheduler. So it's the thing that is doing the bookkeeping and keeping track of what's running is disconnected, is not dependent on the existence of the master kernel.
Okay, so let me ask.
every time you submit something, right, there must be some agent that takes care of the asynchronous and allows you to collect results or job status.
Yes, exactly. So, and that agent is provided by Amazon or provided by Charity Engine, or it is Kubernetes.
Okay, so let me ask this question about task objects, okay? And what comes back, and whether it's a task object or whether it's something different. Do task objects survive across sessions? Actually, Brian on our live stream is asking for sort of clarity on you know, what different kinds of things come back. So right now, if I do a cloud submit, what's going to happen here? Okay, that comes back as a task object. And now that task object does or does not survive the termination of the session?
It does not.
Okay. Does any task object survive the termination of the session?
I haven't really been able to figure this out. It seems that it's only if it is a cloud scheduled task.
So, for example, if I were to say cloud submit of scheduled task.
Yes, which I should note, scheduled tasks do not apply. That's not relevant in the batch submit world. Just to establish that.
No, I understand that. I understand that.
Sure.
It's not scheduled. Batch is just do it as soon as you can.
Right.
Okay, so if I were to do this and schedule a task, then that would create a persistent task object. Is that true?
Define persistent. It will return an expression that can be used in subsequent sessions. That the input form of that expression, but it doesn't persist in any way on the client side beyond the termination of your session. And handler functions, of course, will get disconnected when you terminate the session.
So wait a minute. So but the scheduled task will keep doing its thing.
Yes, in the cloud. And I think if you submit that and then terminate your local session and you keep that expression around and try to do something with it later, I think the only things you can do with that are stuff like stopping it or pausing it and resuming it. I don't think you can.
It has some handle, but the scheduled task is ultimately a cloud object. Is that true? Which is persistent.
Yes.
I mean, what's the difference between cloud submit of a scheduled task and cloud deploy of a scheduled task?
I suspect cloud deploy of a scheduled task doesn't work, but I don't know for sure.
I think it does.
Okay, it's possible. You're right.
Look, what we've got is two different things here. We've got things that have a persistent handle that are tasks independent of where they were started, and we've got things that are, connected to their starter.
Yes, on the task object side, it's only a very limited class of tasks that can be persistent, that persist across sessions. That is cloud scheduled tasks. Because one-shot cloud tasks, the task object can exist in a new session, but from what I've found, you can't do anything useful with it because you can't query output from it. And
this is a mess. I mean, listen, the basic problem is cloud deploy of a scheduled task gives a cloud object. Cloud submit of a scheduled task probably gives a task object.
It does.
That in fact has some persistent character to it.
Persistent in not the task object itself does not have any persistent character.
I know that, but it has a piece of backing that is persistent.
All that is the cloud object. It points to the cloud object.
I know that. I mean, so what we've got here, cloud objects are persistent things, just like your Amazon, whatever that object is that AWS has created in the AWS cloud, effectively, is a persistent flag associated with right with these look, there's a confusion here, okay? Because right now, okay, what is the way that you would do a batch type job submitted to our cloud? It's cloud submit, isn't it?
Yes, but there's a very crucial point there, which is that you cannot query the output after you end your current session. That cannot be done.
Okay, so that's kind of crazy. I mean, but because it doesn't have a persistent thing, unlike a scheduled task, which has a persistent cloud object associated with it, that allows you to ask questions about the scheduled task, a cloud submit job does not have a persistent cloud object associated with it.
No, it does have a persistent cloud object associated with it. You just can't query its output. I don't know why. You just can't.
Okay, so that's probably a bug.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that since the cloud is persistent, there should be a function to query to list all existing task objects, and then you could
There is, except it gives you a cloud object, not a task object. You can do tasks of the string cloud.
Oh gosh, that's horrifying. Okay, how do I find out anything about these things?
The only way I know is to click on it. I don't think you can create a task object from it.
What on earth is going to happen if I click on it?
There's some dashboard thing.
Yeah, you got a dashboard page.
Wow, that's cool. It's a pity it says that. What is this? Well, so this page is nice. And how does this page relate to the page that you would get in AWS?
It's not really the same, because this is intended to communicate information about scheduled tasks. Even if it's a one-shot task, it shows it as a scheduled task that only runs once. But I mean, there is a corresponding page in AWS that you can see for a job.
So this is very interesting. I mean, this is what, I mean, I honestly, I knew we were building this at some point. I don't think I've ever looked at it.
My understanding is that it is expressly for managing scheduled tasks. It is no utility for a one-shot task, except possibly viewing the log. I think there's some way to view log output in there.
But in principle, a batch job, were you to have a batch job in our cloud or in a private cloud, you could imagine a description of what's going on that looks like this.
Yes, I could imagine that.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let's start looking at remote batch submit. Okay.
But can we look at the names? Can we look at the universe of names related to batch submit and see what they all look like with this new naming convention?
Right. So this was the proposal, my proposal, and you can tweak that as you like.
Okay. So I think it should be remote batch submit. Now remind me what map submit does.
That's analogous to parallel map. You give it a function and you give it a list, and it chunks behind the scenes. It chunks up that list into jobs and submits a job for each chunk. If you open up the demo section at the bottom, you can see just an example of what that looks like. But the advantage of that over remote submit, there are two main advantages. One is that you can run jobs that execute simultaneously across multiple machines, because you're not limited to the number of CPUs on one machine. And also you can retrieve partial results. So if only some of the chunks have completed, you can retrieve those results and check that they're right and not insane before waiting. You don't have to wait for the whole entire array job to finish. And this is probably what you will be using for, at least for your larger types of jobs. That's my expectation.
Okay. That name hopefully will change as appropriate.
Of course, that's just the name of the specific job queue in our AWS account. That can have any name that you want.
Okay, but I mean, it should be a name that. Okay, so let's just try to understand this. By the way, a question from Ethan on our live stream: can remote submit work with NetTrain? If so, how do you specify where the data is coming from, and how do you monitor the training?
That's a great question. It does work with NetTrain, and it works very well because you can create EC2 instances that have GPUs attached to them. Your input data, you would specify it either just as an expression that exists in your local session, and it will be picked up automatically because using include definitions semantics. So if you have a variable data in your local session that you've defined, and then you do remote submit of something that does something with data, it will automatically get bundle data up and submit it or upload it along with the job. Or you can use an input file, which is, there's an input files option to remote submit, batch submit, whatever it ends up being called, that lets you specify files on your local machine that, again, get automatically uploaded alongside the job and are accessible within the jobs environment. You can import them. And then on the monitoring
wait a second. What about external storage? Why can't you use an S3 external storage? Why can you directly connect to external storage?
You cannot do it right now, only because there is not an S3 external storage provider. But I very much would like to. That's
coming soon, right?
I know, but it doesn't exist right now, so you can't do it.
Okay, but when you can do it, the data path, if you have an external storage reference in your code, you will simply be able to give that, just like you could reference a local file which will be pulled in when things are packaged up to be sent to the remote job running system. If it's a local file, it will pick up the local file and move it over there. But if it's external storage, it will know, oh, that's S3 external storage. I can just have a separate data path that picks it up directly from S3, correct?
Yes, there will be practically there will be some limitations. Like you will have to use an S3 bucket that your instance has permissions to access. And you won't necessarily be able to use other external storage providers because there's no method, like Dropbox, there's no method for authenticating.
That's tough luck.
Right.
I mean, that's right. You got to move your data to S3 and then you can use it in the AWS environment.
Right, but yes, I definitely hope for this to be possible. And another advantage of it is that if you upload input files using the normal local file system method, you will then be able to obtain the external storage object that represents that previously uploaded input file and use it again in a subsequent job. So you don't have to upload.
Yeah, right. Well, I assume most people will have very large data sets that they've already put on S3, and then they're using this to do the plumbing to connect those large existing data sets into the actual computation system.
Right. Yes, that's possible. There are some advantages of doing the upload using within RemoteSubmit. Well, really, the advantage is that it's guaranteed that the permissions are correct because it uploads the same bucket that it uses to upload the job code itself, and the permissions for those.
But I mean, I think that correct. Okay.
Yes, it will be possible. And just to address the person's question about monitoring progress, you can obtain at least on AWS. This isn't. I don't think this is the case on Charity Engine, at least not yet. But you can obtain the current log, the current standard out log from the kernel basically in real time. You can. It's not automatically. It's not dynamic. You do. It's the job log property of a remote job object, or again, whatever it ends up being called. And I think there is an example of that under RemoteSubmit.
But so question is training progress. You know, we have all those beautiful training progress indicators.
Right.
And
those won't work, but there is a not quite as beautiful, but still reasonable training progress indicator that you see in a standalone kernel in text-only output, and you'll be able to see the output from that by accessing the job log.
Okay, so there's a question about dynamics. I think dynamics are absolutely hopeless on a batch job.
That's correct.
I mean, because they are a thing of real-time feedback loops, which
right. They require the front end to have a connection to the kernel, and that's not the case here.
Okay, question. A number of questions here. There's a question about Microsoft Azure. I believe that is being worked on. Is that a true statement?
Yes, I've looked into it, and Azure has a service that's essentially an analog of AWS Batch, very, very similar and actually more powerful in some ways. So I plan to create a remote submission provider for Azure's Batch service.
So Ethan here is lamenting the fact that the kernel. Well, of course, the kernel does call the front end. It is running a front end, but there's no human seeing it. I mean, this is
well, if it's only running a front end if you launch a front end.
Well, if you need to launch a front end,
right? Like if you want to do notebook manipulation, but there's no way to connect to or see that front end.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I don't understand what you would use dynamics for in a batch setting, but maybe I'm just confused.
Well, I can understand the wanting the desire to see that, like, the net train dynamic progress indicator, because it's true that that's very nice and it's helpful.
But I just think that's not the world of batch processing. I mean,
that's
back
true.
in the
It's
day,
not.
you would put your card deck in a pigeonhole, and somebody would pick it up and then, stuff the printout in the.
Right. Yeah, we don't have a punch
thing.
card external storage provider yet.
No, I understand that, but I mean, the world of batch jobs is not a world where you get to see things in real time.
Correct.
It's at best you see a log file, because I have no idea whether these things actually run quickly or not. I mean, they might, if you say I'm on the slow boat, then what, or I'm waitlisted for whatever, it might take a while for your batch job to run, and then your dynamic will look rather silly.
Right. Well, here you manage the environment that it's submitted to. So so if you configure your environment correctly and essentially are willing to pay, it will run immediately. It only get queued up behind something if you submit basically more jobs than you have configured your environment to run concurrently.
Okay, but I'm sure there's a run this when it's cheap type option and things.
Not really. There is not particularly. It is technically possible to do that because you're using EC2 spot instances, but it's that is not a. Prices do not vary that much enough that it would be useful.
Wow. Okay. Times have changed.
I mean, actually, the prices using on-demand instances, the prices are fixed. The prices only vary when you're using spot instances, which give you a discount over on-demand, but there are some downsides to using spot instances.
That's interesting. Okay, so listen, there are a bunch of comments here on the live stream that are quite interesting, and I'd like to just go through them, and then we'll go back to the. So there's a question here about whether this remote map submit does proper batching. I would assume it is. I mean, I assume it's doing the same thing that parallel map is doing.
Roughly the same thing. It's the same kind of thing. If you scroll down in the demo there, I think there's that job packing. Actually, that's not. Okay,
that
can you scroll up?
Very ugly. Can you please?
I know you said that. You said that last time. It will go through design. Can you scroll up? Actually, there's an example of that one that's better under the items for approval near the top, and then the visualizations, job packing visualization. Right. So the second one of those. The way that remote map submit works is it creates what's called an array job, which is just a container that can contain multiple child jobs within it. And the red square in there represents a single evaluation. So if you have a list of 50 items, each item is one evaluation of your function applied to that item. So it splits up your list of 50 items into, in this case, 6 child jobs of 7 evaluations each and 1 child job with 8 evaluations. So it attempts to, at least by default, you can configure this, but it attempts to shape it into basically a square where like rows are. But
it presumably depends on how long each job takes and things.
No, because it doesn't know. This is done at when you evaluate remote map submit. It cannot reconfigure itself subsequently depending on how long things are taking.
So why is this not resizable? Or is it resizable, but it's just, why is this so slow to resize? It's crazy. Okay, so how does this relate to this kind of dashboard?
How does what relate? Job packing?
Well, what you're saying is that this is so job packing visualization is merely for your information. This is how the jobs are packed, but
yes.
It's not telling you the ID numbers of jobs and things.
Correct. It's not telling. Yeah, it's just it's a useful visualization for understanding what remote map submit is doing with your job. The dashboard that you're showing. I mean, there isn't. What does it actually show? Because if you want to see the machines, you can go to the EC2 dashboard in the AWS console. But that's not particularly useful except for debugging. what else does this dashboard, like stuff like CPU usage? You can also get that from AWS, from CloudWatch.
Okay, so one of the things we could imagine doing is having some utility that will collect the necessary information from AWS and display a thing like this for you.
Yes, but it's a little tricky to do that, because there can be multiple jobs running on one instance, and if you have two array jobs, there could be like one child job from one array job and one child job from another array job running on the same instance, and you can only usefully get CPU information at the full instance level. So it would be you could perhaps ask for a dashboard that just shows your whole environment without regard for what jobs are where. But I don't think there's any useful way to provide visualization of CPU utilization on the individual job level.
Okay, fair enough. All right, let's just quickly go through these other things, and then I want to come back. So there are various comments here about basically if you've got a piece of code and it runs locally, and then you say, now I want to send it out for batch running and so on.
As seamless as we can. You can, for one thing, you can wrap RemoteSubmit in basically any chunk of code, and it will run it remotely on a single instance with up to in the case of AWS 96 vCPUs. But you can configure that, of course.
So just to be clear, the remote, if it's a remote job submit, right? Can the remote job submit, I keep on asking the same question. Can the remote job submit contain a parallel table?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so it just is living on a 96 core machine, and whatever you would normally be able to do on a 96 core machine, you'll be able to do.
Correct. RemoteSubmit is a single job that can have access to multiple vCPUs.
Or what we're now calling remote batch submit.
Right. If that's what we're calling it. I think it would be useful to actually go over the names and decide what they will be, because
I know, but I want to understand the full functionality and how it relates to the functionality we don't have and so on as well.
Okay, sure. Now there is a caveat to the to having it just work, which is that for maximum efficiency, it's always good to build your code from the ground up with the idea of having it be parallelized. That's the case with the existing parallelization functionality, and it is also the case here with remote map submit. That doesn't like you can convert a parallel map into a remote map submit because it's the same syntax. But for example, if you have multiple maps in sequence, those have to become multiple jobs.
Well, for example, you can't nest.
Correct. You can't nest.
I mean, you can't nest, even in the case of parallel table, you can't nest that either.
Right.
But, you could clearly nest a parallel table inside a remote batch map submit.
No, you can't, because remote batch map submit is launching. You can always configure these things, but there is the case where remote batch map submit is launching, say, 10 jobs, each of which have 16 vCPUs allocated to them, and it will chunk up your list of, say, 160 items into 10 chunks. One goes to each machine, or one goes to each job, which is actually a Docker container, and then it will use parallel map inside that job to map your function across that list of 16 items. So it will be using parallelization. It automatically parallelizes.
Okay. So your comment about rewriting code and so on, I mean, basically, look, I use parallel stuff all the time. And, occasionally I do something stupid where I haven't realized there's just tons and tons of data to be sent across the parallel links. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's a total lose. And yes, things like that can happen. Let's just go through a couple of the other. Okay, so there's a question about block map with block sizes chosen for optimal time memory threads. Yeah, I mean, that's this is trying to do.
Yes, and you can configure it. You see there it says method goes to automatic. There are 3 other method parameters that are influenced by the methods for parallel combine, which also apply to parallel map and parallel table. They're not exactly the same, but they're similar, and they let you basically change effectively change what that visualization looks like,
Okay.
change how it chunks.
Let's just go through quickly some of the other things on the live stream, then I want to come back to function naming and so on.
Sure.
Question from Alexander here: is there a task ID when running Cloud Submit, and then the cloud maintains the relationship between the task ID and the completion object ID? Right. I mean, that has to do with this question about persistent tasks, which I think is a mess, and I think we should look at separately. I mean, I think basically, if it's persistent, it's a cloud object. If it's a task object, it's somehow ephemeral to that particular job. But you should probably be able to rehydrate a task object from a cloud object. Am I making sense?
Yes, that sounds reasonable to me. It's just
if you could do that, then we would solve the problem. I mean, in other words, then the task object is specific, to a particular master job, so to speak. But then subsequently, you just say task object of a cloud object, where the cloud object is the persistent, monument or something to the task that you submitted. Roman, is that your thing, or how would that work?
It's not Roman's thing, I don't think.
Whose thing is it? Todd, is it? Do you know how that would work?
I think Constantine is currently responsible for tasks.
Okay, so why don't we find out whether that can, maybe Carla can go track that down and find out whether that can be made to work. So in other words, given that the strategy is this: a task object is local to a session. Okay, if it is going to be persistent, it is a cloud object. But you can wrap a task object around that to get task-like functionality in a new session based on your pre-existing persistent cloud object. I mean, what this is, it reminds me very much of the persistent value system somehow. I mean, in other words, it's a persistent job of a kind that we don't, that's a new kind of thing for us. We have persistent storage, cloud objects of that. This is a persistent job of some kind, or persistent task of some kind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, there are various ways one way, obvious way is to, if you submit something to the cloud, then the natural thing to use is the cloud object, and you should be able to get back a useful task object in a local session. But for other cases where it's not the cloud, I mean, you should be able to store your task objects in a local object, for example. That would survive a session restart, and then same way you should be able to get back a connection.
I'm not sure that the task object is what you should. I don't think that's the right thing. I don't think the task object should be the persistent object.
Can we clarify what exactly we're talking about? We're not talking about remote batch jobs, right? Or are we?
No, we're talking about things that you do with local submit, session submit, and maybe a future remote submit that we don't have yet.
Right. Well, local submit and session submit, obviously, there's no. It's impossible for that to be persistent because they're both intimately linked to the master kernel. Because local submit is in the subkernel, session submit is in the master kernel, running preemptively. So cloud submit is the only existing submission, like X submit function where it makes sense to have persistence, and there just right now is not that much persistence.
Right, but I'm saying what persists is a cloud object, but then you can rehydrate that cloud object in a subsequent session to treat it as a task in a subsequent session. I think this requires separate investigation. But okay, so I just want to go through some of these other. Let's see. SWSH is suggesting Kubernetes PaaS. What is that?
Platform as a service, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not. They might be talking about hosted Kubernetes solutions. Okay.
Yes.
Well, this would work for that because Kubernetes is very much infrastructure independent if everything is set up correctly.
Well, so wait a minute. So this is saying Kubernetes platform as a service with Wolfram Engine ready workers on them.
Is this in relation to? I think this is in relation to remote batch submit.
Yes, right. This is your proposal of a Kubernetes. I think.
Well, yeah, it's Kubernetes. It's remote batch submit. Sorry, I'm still wrapping my mouth around the new name. Remote batch submit to any Kubernetes cluster, whether it be on your local network or on Google Cloud or Azure or AWS.
Right, but then eventually we would have a thing that you download from us, like you can download Wolfram engines, which will be a Kubernetes, a container that is the thing you need to be able to run, to be able to be the server for a remote batch submit to a Kubernetes cluster.
Right. It's a little more than that. It's the container is one thing, and there's also the configuration around it. But yes, that is that would be packaged into in Kubernetes. It's called a chart. That's the configuration of they use nautical terminology. Configuration of multiple services.
How could they not use nautical? Given that Kubernetes comes from a helmsman, right, in Greek.
Right. Yeah, they use nautical terminology for everything, I think.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so the comment here was with the Kubernetes platform as a service. SW is saying one can mount persistent volumes from whatever provider that is supported by Kubernetes plugins.
Yes, persistent volumes are actually very important for remote batch submit because it has to have somewhere to store input and output files from jobs, and those output files need to still be accessible after the job has finished. So having persistent volumes that are accessible across machines is an important thing to have.
Right. So SW is saying, wouldn't it be great to rent hourly clusters from us? I mean, basically, we're not in the business of providing sort of as large scale things as something like AWS or Azure. Our cloud, and by the way, there's comments about scheduled tasks only running granularities of an hour. That's because that's necessary for our scheduling purposes in our cloud. If you have an enterprise private cloud, an instance of our cloud, then that restriction is no longer present. But
and
that's just something.
I think I may be wrong about this, but I think if you have certain levels of paid plan, you can have scheduled tasks that run more frequently.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, but the problem is that we have to limit that because we don't have infinite infrastructure, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. With remote batch submit, we're providing you you get the choice of cloud provider, and you manage your infrastructure on that provider. You decide.
Right.
How
I mean, whether eventually we will be able to do this through our own credit system, and whether you'll be able to just have an account with us, I'm not sure. That's, I think, a more or less a detail. Okay, there's a question here about remote submit with a money constraint. How does that work?
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea, and it makes sense. It's just depending on the provider, it may be more or less difficult. On AWS, it's more difficult because AWS is essentially choosing the instance types that it launches to satisfy your jobs based on your job's requirements. You can set constraints on that, like only use this instance type. But by default, and it makes the most sense to allow AWS to make these choices, it will choose instance types depending on your jobs. Now it is possible to calculate roughly how much a given job will cost beforehand. In fact, I have a form for that that's linked.
How can you do that? I mean, you're running a random Turing machine. You don't know if it holds.
Oh, and based on knowing how long or estimates on how long your job will take.
I see. Okay, fair enough. I see. So how much wall clock time it will take, given that you know how much CPU time it's taking or something.
Right, exactly. And depending on how you want to how you slice it up if you're using.
There's a question here is more about our engine. What's the memory footprint of our engine? It's quite small, isn't it?
Yeah, what I've found is that parallel, I don't know that much about this, but what I've found just in my experimentation is that parallel subkernels each require around 200 megabytes absolute minimum to start and not spontaneously die.
That's exceptionally modest in the modern world.
Yeah, I think so. And depending on what you're doing, obviously the memory footprint will increase. I have remote batch submit configured when you're using AWS, you can change these options, but by default, it will allocate. I think it's about 2 gigabytes or 2 gigabytes rather of memory per CPU, per vCPU. And you can change that, but it's a reasonable minimum, so your subkernels don't spontaneously die, because that happens if you don't give them enough memory.
Okay, let's take a look now at all these detailed names and things. Okay, so let's look at okay, so what we're talking about, I mean, this thing, remote batch map submit. Boy, that's pretty ugly as a name.
I mean, why do you want the word remote in there? I mean, isn't that remote is
because we have other
overused,
things
right?
like batch applied, which is a I just feel like it's part of the remote family, because it's really not on our infrastructure. You know, things that don't have remote are on our infrastructure, just like the word external means it's not in our language, basically.
Isn't batch submission always remote?
It is implied, but it's not. It's true that it's not really explicit.
Well, okay, so Roman is claiming that we could just leave it as batch submit. I don't know. I think that's going to be confusing to people. I think they're going to think you can do batch submission on your local machine, which you cannot without lots of additional infrastructure.
That's true.
Well, they'll see that there's only a set of providers to this. You know, there's a fixed set of providers, Charity and Amazon at the moment, and you know.
I still think it would be cleaner conceptually. I mean, this is setting this up is a big, complicated thing. Typing an extra however many 6 characters is not going to be the main thing. The question is the conceptual clarity.
But is it similar enough to other remote? I mean, remote evaluate, remote run.
Well, remote evaluate. Well, okay, so remote evaluate takes a machine name, right?
Yes.
Okay. And we can imagine a remote submit that is like remote evaluate and just takes a machine name.
Well, we have imagined it, but there are a fair bit of engineering would be required to make that work. It's not a simple thing, because then we have to have a scheduler that runs on that machine. It is conceptually
but what
possible,
happens if you say remote submit and what you give as the machine ID is a batch submission environment? Is that great?
Well, wait, that's what it is right now.
That's what is?
Well, the only extant remote submit is the existing name of what we are going to change to batch submit or remote batch submit. And the syntax for remote submit is you give it a remote submission environment.
I understand. But I'm saying that remote evaluate conceptually could have one of these, except it will come back and say, no, you can't do that because this has to be an asynchronous thing. Or maybe it does it. Maybe it just takes it and it does it as a blocking thing, and you might wait for 15 minutes.
I think that makes sense in theory. It would be up to Roman as to whether that totally breaks other assumptions on how remote evaluate is supposed to work. If that would just be in
no, I mean, remote evaluate is pretty open. The common thread is that it blocks and until the thing is here. And
so that wouldn't be completely crazy then.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a simple up value, right? I mean, you could have up values for any kind of environments that allow you to submit, to start something and wait until it finishes and get the result back.
Right.
Yes,
now,
that's entirely possible.
Right. Now, there are also options of remote submit, which aren't options of remote evaluate. I'm not sure how we'd want to handle that.
Fine.
And I mean, there's cloud submit, which could also, I mean, that actually makes a lot of sense to be able to say remote evaluate and give as argument a cloud base.
Fine.
So conceptually, there's nothing that, I mean, it should be pretty easy to. I mean, the overlap of functionality is very small, but it's just a convenient way of saying remote evaluate of some environment, expression, and that environment will then know what to do. I mean,
okay, so then with that in mind, it seems to me that in the future we should have a remote submit that can take an arbitrary environment. Right now, we only have the one case of batch environments. But what that's making me think is that, again, we should defensively name it right now remote batch submit, with the idea that in the future, we will have a general remote submit, and that the remote batch submit will become a special case that will largely be run by people just changing their submission environment. So that, as somebody was asking on the live stream here, it becomes easy to just say, okay, I'm going to say remote. I can actually just have a list of possible places that I can remote evaluate. Our cloud, some machine of yours, AWS, Azure, whatever else. And I just have to pick that first argument to decide what to do.
Okay, I agree with that on the basis that I would like to keep my code base, which is currently called RemoteSubmit, dedicated to batch submission. It would be too confusing to have to later introduce other things into it that are not batch submission. And what makes the most sense for having that happen is to rename it to something more specific, like remote batch submit, and keep remote submit open for That's
what I think we should do. And I think we should have a longer term plan that we're going to have a remote submit, of which remote batch submit becomes a special case.
But Stephen, let me make sure I understand the long-term plan. Are you suggesting that we have remote evaluate and remote submit, the sort of grand functions that if given a certain type of environment, like a batch submission environment or something, would then do the batch thing? And the difference is that, but in remote submit, in remote evaluate blocks, and remote submit returns a task object. Is that?
Yep, that's the idea.
Okay,
that sounds reasonable.
Now, by the way, remote batch submit is not returning a task object, is it?
Correct. It's returning a remote right now, a remote job object. It will become, I don't know, remote batch job object.
Right. So remote job object is the analog of a cloud submit of a scheduled task, returning a task object wrapped in a cloud object, wrapping a cloud object. So one could imagine in the future that the remote submit of one of these things returns a task object that wraps a remote job object.
Yes, I think that sounds good.
Okay. So then the raw version is then remote batch submit, and it returns the raw remote batch job object. And in the future, that would get wrapped.
Right.
Okay, so fine. So let's keep going here. So now
I want to say why I like this idea. I like this idea because it allows remote submit and remote job object, etc. Again, whatever they get called. I'm just using the names that I know. To have interfaces that are relatively complex and make sense and have things that are specific to them, while having this idea in the future of having a task object that wraps a remote job object. And provides a simplified, consistent interface. It means that I don't have to artificially simplify the remote job object, batch job object interface to make it fit into the existing task object.
And so people who just want to do simple things will use the high level wrapper. People who want to fill in all the details will use the lower level thing. It's exactly the same as external evaluate, where most people just say external evaluate of Python, comma, whatever. But if they want to, they can use external evaluate of the, what is it called? What is the first argument called? External
session something?
External session object.
Yeah, external session.
Right. And get much more detailed and say which instance of which version, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But most of the time, people don't care. Okay, let's keep going here. All right, so now.
So have we written down the names? Let's get the exact names written down.
Okay, so what we're saying is remote batch submit here, remote batch. I'm not that keen on that name.
I don't think there's a better option, because you kind of have to have map and you have to have.
I have to have map. I agree. The thing that's weird is we don't have a parallel map submit.
Well, because we don't parallel submit is something that it really is quite different from any other submission thing. It's more of a, Roman, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's more of a queuing system than like submit, which implies asynchronous action.
Well, I mean, it's both. I mean, the point is that the queuing system works because parallel jobs are asynchronous. Right?
Sorry, does somebody know if I have a section here already for this?
I think you do, because you saved something in the last meeting.
I have an AWS link section here. Not sure that's the right place for this.
Remote submit.
No R's. Oh yes, no. Drat. What should I call this? Well, I'm going to put it under AWS link. Okay.
Okay, that's not a good categorization in the long run.
Okay, so
AWS
Carla,
link is
can you move that to something? Can you move that AWS link thing and the other thing and both of these to something called let's say remote computation?
Okay, will do.
Because the thing that it exists that is called AWS link is completely separate from anything that we're discussing here.
Okay, right. Remote batch job. Whoops. Remote batch job object.
I want to ask Roman though, with parallel submit, is it possible to have a scenario where the main kernel is not blocking, but parallel kernels are doing some computation? Can that state exist?
Well, I mean, they will, once something has been submitted, then these kernels will run and until their jobs are done, but then they will become idle until you trigger another round.
But they don't, are the kernels ever running when you're not doing wait all?
Well, as long as there's something to do, yes. I mean, you see, even the parallel submit itself will trigger a queue run. And so
okay, parallel submit itself will start evaluate. Okay. And then why is it called wait? Or so okay.
Because
is this right? If you do okay, is this right? If you do parallel submit and your evaluation on your parallel kernel starts and then it finishes and then you do wait all, it will return immediately.
Yes, if they're all finished, yes.
Okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on here. Okay, do we need the word submission in here?
I think so, because it is the thing that it is.
Okay.
I'm not certain. We can discuss it, but
well, let's see what it is in more detail when we get to that documentation.
Okay, sure.
Okay, remote batch jobs just returns the list of remote batch job objects.
Exactly.
Okay. So this is now
right. So these I'd like any comments on the structure, because I want to be able to give this to the docs team, because I think they have to, manual work is required to implement a new new ref page type. So this is these pages are intended to document the things that are specific to individual providers.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be similar to what we have for blockchains, for example.
Yes.
You know, you should just have used the function repository mechanism for creating tables and things.
How's that different? I mean, this isn't supposed to be style
and so on.
Oh well, this is just content. This is no styling or layout. That will happen when it's actually a proper ref page. Right now, it's just a plain notebook.
So, what is the category? Remote batch submission
remote
provider.
Exactly. Yes.
Why does the word submission in there? Remote batch.
Well, there has to be a verb,
provider.
right? Okay, but submission makes it clear that it's asynchronous. I mean,
I see.
Or I mean, I don't know. Maybe batch also makes it clear that it's asynchronous.
I just think submission provider suggests that they're providing the submission mechanism rather than that they're providing the mechanism that you submit to.
Well, they are providing the submission mechanism for a certain parse of that phrase. It is the mechanism with which you submit. Mechanism.
But
yeah,
they're also providing the mechanism that actually does the computation.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And I noticed
that raises the question whether this is a submission environment or a computation environment.
Computation environment I want to avoid because there is a specific thing on AWS called a compute environment, which is related to all of this, but it is not. It's not. We don't represent it in the Wolfram language. So that specific phrasing I want to avoid.
So wait a minute. Is this thing here the submission infrastructure, or is it the actual environment that's running things?
It is a data structure. It is that represents bits of data that RemoteSubmit needs to be able to submit a job. It uses this data. It tells it where to submit the job.
But does that include you've got a 96 CPU GPU enabled computer and things?
No, that's on a. There's no technical reason that couldn't be the case. But I chose to put things that I think people want to choose on the job level as options to RemoteSubmit, and then things that I think people will want to keep the same across multiple jobs in the the submission
okay, so then the correct term is submission environment.
I think so, yeah.
I think that the name of this category should be batch computation environment. The name of these category pages. That's what I would suggest.
Okay. Why are you okay with omitting? I don't object to that, but I'm just curious. Why are you okay with omitting remote in that case, since we're using remote everywhere else?
Because it's obvious it's remote. I mean, it's just like when we say, and now I'm going to prove myself wrong, but I'm pretty sure when we have the documentation for Python, for example, that we don't say, okay. So I'm proving myself wrong here.
Well, it has to say external. Evaluation system wouldn't make any sense in that particular context. That would be totally ambiguous.
I think it's like we don't say for an import format. We don't say that it is. Okay, I admit this probably is better as remote batch computation provider.
I mean, it's just I doubt we will ever have a batch computation provider that is not a remote batch computation provider, and if we do, then it would only be one, which is local.
I'm just thinking of I'm thinking of for Microsoft employees using Azure. Mm-hmm. Is it a remote batch computation provider, or is it? It's very confusing. It's remote to us.
Right. I mean, it's remote to everybody because it's in some data center somewhere where there are just a couple of technicians. I mean, on a physical level, it is almost always remote.
Suggestion from Alexander on a live stream to use the word processing instead of computation.
We don't really say processing anywhere.
Yeah, we don't really anymore. It's not
except when referring to, we don't even processing that word. I don't think we use. We have processes, but.
Okay, I don't know whether we should have the word remote here. Let's okay. Let's take.
So are you okay with the structure of those pages? So like the headings and
yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not as familiar with. My only issue with those pages would be, I'm a practical person. I want to use this. Boy, I mean, this is so complicated. My gosh.
What part is complicated? What part are you looking at and saying that it's complicated?
Well, just the length of stuff that's here. So, I mean, my question would be, for me, okay, I got a piece of code. I want to run it. How much of this do I have to read?
You have to read, if this is your very first time, you have to read that workflow, which does not exist. under setup, I plan to have a workflow for each remote submission provider, which details the one-time setup steps that you need to do.
So it's like give them my credit card number, and
well, not exactly that, because we can link to something that says how to set up an AWS account if you don't have an AWS account. But even if you already have an AWS account, you have to configure some infrastructure on AWS, and I will make that as seamless and as automatic as I possibly can. But there will be some manual elements, because there are always some manual elements, and it's important to make people make manual choices when those choices affect how much money they're going to spend, I think.
Yes.
So once that is set up, you can skip all of those sections. You can go down to example and drop your code in there. Well, you have to construct that remote submission environment object, which I'll try to have the configuration process just output one of those. And you can store it somewhere. You can put it in that $default remote submission environment, so it's your default.
Okay, so you should say that somewhere here in the example. You should maybe even the first example, you should just say paste in from wherever, because otherwise somebody will look at this and they'll say, "Oh my God, where am I going?"
They'll think they can use that. Right. Okay, but yeah, that's fair. So then you have that thing, and then you can right ahead. You can go do the second line, which is remote submit your code, that environment.
Okay, except you want to flip the order of the arguments.
Right, I didn't flip them yet, because I wanted to just get the final approval on that, because that also affects
I agree with flipping the order.
Well, you were the only one who suggested that. So you
okay.
But yes, okay. Flipping the order. And just to be clear, for Roman's benefit, do you also want to flip the order for remote evaluate? Because remote evaluate has, I believe, the same expression machine IP machine host name.
Yeah, I think that's necessary. I mean, I don't.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, the problem is that in remote evaluate, it makes a certain amount of sense to have a default machine, and so it's always a bit strange when the first argument is optional.
We survived.
I think that's perfectly fine. Yes. I mean,
okay, but remote evaluate is not yet in the system, right?
It's in the prototype.
Okay, fine. Okay, so we can flip that.
Yes.
Good.
Yes,
let's do it. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Option. Okay. So remote batch map submit. Environment function list. I agree.
And the environment can be omitted if you have a default environment set.
Yes, because you can't omit the other arguments here.
Right.
And similarly, remote batch submit, the environment can be omitted.
Yes, absolutely.
Default. Brian is asking, what happens to echo on a remote batch job?
Echo will get sent to the standard out log. If you try echo in a standalone kernel, you will see it has a special appearance. It's actually not that great, because if you know that you can have a tag in echo, which is the second argument. If you use a tag, it does not put a space between the tag and the body, and that's actually probably a bug that I should file. But echo does have a special appearance in a standalone kernel that's distinct from print, and it will show up that way in the log.
What is this? I've not seen that. That greeting, Wolfram desktop kernel.
I think that's always been there. It's just different, because I guess this is in a Wolfram desktop installation instead of Mathematica. But I think that's always been there. I mean, for as long as I can remember, just that long. So you get those two arrows.
So echo label. You're saying
no, just echo of like 2, some string. Right. So it doesn't.
That's terrible. That's a bug.
Yeah.
And is it obvious that we shouldn't put the hello before the greater than?
I think that would make sense. Yeah.
To put it before, but doesn't it come before in the desktop in the notebook?
No, it comes after, I think, but it's styled differently. It's styled like the greater than.
Maybe we should flip it in both cases. By the way, that doesn't have the right spacing either.
Well, it's better than no spacing.
I know, but this looks stupid. There's a big space here, and then I think it's just the wrong way around.
Okay, I personally prefer how it is right now in the front end. but not in the
Who deals with this? Who's dealing with this? Anybody know? Carla, you go track down who's dealing with this.
Okay, will do.
And I would make this weak suggestion that we put the tag before the greater than, but that may not be supportable for other reasons.
I think the greater than has to be first so we can clearly see what thing's coming from echo, and not from.
Yeah, that's true.
Fine.
And I would also keep it that way in the standalone kernel.
All right. Okay. Fine. Then it's just a bug here. Although it's a pity that there's no delimiter at the end of that in the standalone kernel, possibly another greater than to indicate the end of that styling or something. I'm not sure.
Right. Or a colon.
Or colon or something.
Colon perhaps.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'd like to see how you actually get to that log.
Okay, if you scroll down to the demos section.
Yeah, and it's saying in 12.2 it's fixed that there is a space.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, say that again. Demos.
Yeah, down to demos and the remote submit section, not remote map submit.
Okay.
And scroll down a little.
Okay, so this is our environment. Boy, that's a horrifying piece of infrastructural gunk.
Well, it has to exist because we need all of that data.
I understand that, but ultimately there's infrastructural gunk.
Yeah, that's true.
Our goal is to hide the infrastructural gunk.
So down it's a little bit more. There, job log.
I see.
So those two long horizontal lines, any messages or logs produced from within your job code will go inside there.
So is there any way to make this more computable, this job log?
I don't think so. I mean, it fundamentally exists as a string.
I mean, we could choose to tag it and bring it in. I mean, if it's only going to be consumed by our users in our system, we could add tagging information in that string that would allow us to reconstitute it as something more, allow us to parse it as something.
Okay, parse it as what? One bit of information that isn't there is timestamps. On AWS, not necessarily the case everywhere else. On AWS, there is a timestamp associated with each line, which I don't show there.
Well, maybe we should have another thing called job log.
I would do that as like an option to the sub value if we could. So like job log, comma, show timestamps goes to true.
We could do that, but I think we could say timed job log.
Right now, this is the least common denominator format. If a provider gives me a log, we will have it in at least this format. It's possible that there will be
fine, but if you say timed job log, then it can give a message saying, "Sorry, this provider doesn't give one of those."
Sure.
I think timed job log.
Why don't we just have one job log that has times if it can be provided or not? I understand why you want to have all these extra options for
because I could imagine. Well, okay. So the question is, what consumes this?
I think a human should consume that. I think the most useful scenario is.
Well, I mean, what you're going to see. Okay, I have no idea what you're going to see. I mean, at some level, are you going to see a virtual machine booting in this log, or
no,
what?
No. You will see this. And then between those horizontal lines, if there are any error messages or prints or echoes from your code, the code that you submit, they will show up there.
Okay, but in a perfect world, this would reconstitute itself as notebook output.
But it's not. It never existed as a notebook.
Right, but insofar as there is a correspondence between, you could say that about the actual process that is the kernel is producing these things, but they are packaged in such a way that in a notebook they will show up in a nice format.
That's not true. Try NetTrain.
Yeah, here.
Yeah, in the standalone kernel.
What do I NetTrain with?
Just get the example from the documentation. I don't know the syntax.
Well, I know the syntax, but I don't know what.
Well,
okay.
there's a simple example in the documentation.
Am I going to see the
Just grab the first one.
Really? Is that enough?
Yeah, it worked for me.
Okay. Oh, wow.
So this has no correspondence, no direct correspondence to what you'd see in a notebook. It represents the same thing that you get from that dynamic.
Well, it's useful.
Yes, it's very useful. And it's the person had asked earlier about using NetTrain with RemoteSubmit. This is the data, the live data that you'd be able to get. But I can't think of any useful way to convert this into a notebook, at least not any way that would look
Actually, here's a
worse.
suggestion from SW on the live stream. What if there is a job log event series? Okay, which would actually be the so this would become, I mean, that would be cute. Which is actually the event series.
It would be cute, but there's very limited utility to an event series with string values, because you can't do anything that you normally, I mean, except like, I don't know, just plotting the times, but you can't do anything that you would normally do with an event series. I think it would be better to have like a data set with timestamps and strings.
Possibly, yes, possibly.
But something to remember is that this log could potentially, depending on what kind of messages or debug output you put in, this log could be very big, and it could be well, okay, data set should in theory be able to handle something.
I think so, but okay. I mean, look, I agree that this is the good place to start. Is just to have this.
So are we suggesting job log, which perhaps has timestamps added if they're available, and then job log data set?
I'm not suggesting adding the timestamps if they're available. Well,
okay.
I don't know.
Well, job log data set would have the timestamps if they're available, I think.
I think that's right. Yes, I think that's the right thing to. You know what? If they're available, you should probably put them in job log. And we should probably have another version of something called job log messages, let's say, that only gives the messages.
Well, messages, that's something different. If you want messages, okay, if you want messages from a job that succeeded, which remember has no bearing, whether your code did what you expect has no bearing on whether the job succeeded. But the job succeeded if it didn't crash. So if the job succeeded, you can get the evaluation messages property of the job object, and that will be like you see in the evaluation data about that's there's messages and messages text. So if you want just the messages, you can get them from that. Which I'll note does not have timestamps, but I don't think that's really what
right. By the way, SWSH on the live stream is pointing out the timeline plot would work nicely on a job log event series, and it isn't completely useless, because if between those double lines you are, the only communication is from an echo, right? Then you can perfectly well put some echoes into your code, and you'll be able to see easily what's going on. And in fact,
like with the tooltip on the
well, on the timeline plot for sure, but you can certainly imagine if you've got that as, look, having it as a data set is fine, but then if you've echoed something which is an expression or something,
we don't know if it's an expression or not. We only know it's a string because it's.
Well, I know we only know it's a string, but if you know that you only echoed expressions, then you could potentially. Look, I suspect that we will need eventually is something which, for example, only gives you the stuff between these two lines, right? So that it is just a from your job reporting, okay? And then you control the from your job reporting. And if you put stupid stuff in there, then you'll get stupid stuff out. But if you put in just as I have often done, I put in, when I run overnight jobs, I very, very, very often have, things that come out which allow me to see roughly what happened.
Okay, I would like to propose that job log is just the stuff between the lines. Job full log is everything. Job log data set is a data set of just the stuff between the lines. Now we're adding like half a dozen properties, but job full log data set could be everything.
Fine. That sounds like good. Job full log. Okay. Job log.
And just so we're clear, I don't think this affects anything, but it is possible to have a job that has no lines if a failure happened before it entered your code, only one line, or if a failure happened in your code, like it crashed while it was running your code.
Right, it's outside okay. Look, anything that came from your job as valid output from your job shows up in job log. Anything that is meta information, like the thing crashed, is in full log.
In addition to the stuff from your job, or you should just, would that instead be like job meta log or something?
Well, I think it should be an addition for now. We may later realize that we only want the stuff outside the lines.
Okay, I agree, but I should mention, you said stuff like it crashed. We don't particularly know if it crashed. I actually, now that I think about it, I should have the functionality. I should be able to insert in a log if the process itself crashed. But right now, the best that we'll have is just whatever the last message or print or whatever it was.
I think it would be nice to put in something with a star that shows it's coming from somewhere else, and then job crashed or something.
Right. Yeah. Right now, that's not possible, but I have some changes I already intend to make, which will make that possible.
Okay. So Ethan was suggesting earlier, can you add an in-notebook master scheduling dashboard with UI and ETAs? And he later offered you Swiss chocolates if you do that.
Okay, well, I was going to say no, but since I heard about the Swiss chocolates, now I'm considering. I mean, we would be largely reinventing what you can already get if you go to the AWS console.
I see.
I mean, they don't have ETAs, but it's only in some jobs will an ETA actually be something.
You know, Parallel Map Monitored, which is in the function repository, I use all the time, and it has an ETA, and it's quite useful.
Okay, well, I have my dynamic status visualization, which is in the same class of thing. It does not have an ETA right now, but I don't think there's any reason it couldn't. It would be an ETA. This is only for array jobs submitted with remote batch map submit, which I think that's the only case in which you can have an ETA. You can't do it for a single evaluation. But yes, I think I could have an ETA in that. It probably wouldn't be as accurate because the timing data is not as granular as it is. This Parallel Map Monitor knows for every single evaluation, while this only knows for the child jobs, which are chunks of multiple evaluations. But it would be possible, I think, to add an ETA estimate. An ETA to the dynamic status visualization.
Okay, so hold on. I have to go to another meeting fairly soon here. So there's a comment about the importance of having beta testing of all of this stuff, and hopefully we will be able to make it available to testers fairly soon. Is that once we've got this naming straightened out, we should be able to make some versions available? Is that true?
There's licensing, which I'm working on and need to finish. But after that's done, I think we can, and the necessary documentation for like setting up your own environment. Those are the things required.
Right. Okay. Forward cloud credentials. What the heck is that?
It's actually quite useful. It copies your local cloud credentials into the remote kernel, so you can do cloud things from within that kernel.
Oh my God, that is my gosh, this is so hairy. Okay.
Well, okay. Hold on. One thing I just want to say: that exact wording, forward cloud credentials, is an option in the parallel preferences section of the preferences, and it does what it sounds like. It forwards your master kernel cloud credentials into subkernels. So I didn't invent the wording. I just invented making it an option in the language.
But how does that work? I mean, does it forward all your EPC credentials? Does it do cryptography? What does it do?
It forwards whatever your credentials are, which is your OAuth token.
But it doesn't do it in any kind of plain text form, or does it?
Well, it does do it. It does do it in plain text, but it's always being sent over and stored. It's sent over an encrypted link. It's stored in a private bucket. In the case of S3, I have it explicitly. You cannot do it on Charity Engine. There's no technical reason why not. I have it disabled because it's a security risk because your code is running on someone else's computer, and they could make their way in and get your credentials from inside there. But if
is that obvious that you can't have some cryptographic mechanism for you to?
It is obvious because they're controlling the computer. Fundamentally, they can get in. If there's a cryptographic key somewhere, they can find it because again, it's running on their computer.
I see, but unless you had a third-party verifier of that key, that is, unless you are simply from that remote computer pinging something which then picks up your key. Never mind, it doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Okay, wait a minute. This is a weird concept. I mean, where else haven't we needed this? Isn't this what the authentication option with? Isn't this what the keychain stuff does?
Keychain stuff is all local.
Yes, I mean, keychain stores your password to actually log into the cloud. But say in your parallel computation, so you are logged into the cloud in your master kernel, and now you want to do parallel evaluate of.
No, I get
cloud
it. But something which
so,
uses an entity and it needs your cloud credentials and so on.
Yes.
So what would it be called? What is the name of a? I've suddenly blanked out on what's the name that we've given for something from the keychain. What are we calling that?
System credential key, or system credential.
Okay, so system credential.
But that's system. It's your local system. There's no relevance anywhere else.
Okay, does this forward your cloud credentials for a private cloud?
Yes. It does, but it does, but it won't necessarily work. If your private cloud is behind a VPN or something, then the EC2 instance, unless you do manual network configuration, it's not going to be able to get it. But it makes it a best effort attempt to send all the necessary cloud.
But maybe the right thing to describe here is not the cloud credentials, but to have the possibility of having an association that can give you, given that your code references a cloud, here's how you try to get to it.
I'm not sure. I don't understand what you mean.
Well, so I mean, let's imagine you've set Cloudbase to myinternalserver.com, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And from your code on AWS, you see this piece of code, and it just says, cloud evaluate of myinternalserver.com, okay?
Mm-hmm.
With Cloudbase of myinternalserver.com.
Wait,
right?
So now you're specifying the Cloudbase explicitly in your job code.
That is correct. In my job, I'm specifying the Cloudbase, but I'm not specifying in my job any credentials because I already did a Cloud Connect in my local session, which set up those credentials. But okay, let me back up for a second. This is the alternative to saying Cloud Connect in AWS, right?
This is the alternative. This is more secure because you're not embedding your password in the job code.
I understand that. I'm just saying.
But yes, it is the alternative. You're right.
Okay, so in principle, for parallel kernels, how do parallel kernels? You're saying parallel kernels already have this option.
Yes.
Yes, it's not exposed programmatically, but it's an option in the preferences, the front end preferences. And it's called forward cloud credentials.
I just don't particularly like the name because I'm thinking, like forward could be it's not necessarily a verb.
Well, but I mean that's how authentication happens more and more. I mean, if you have a Google account and then you log in somewhere else, you often have the option of using your Google account and kind of.
I understand. So what's our general mechanism for that? I mean, that's what we do with single sign-on, right? That single sign-on.
Yes, I mean that's the whole and all that stuff.
I don't think that's related to what's going on here, though, because this is doing is copying the stuff that is already in your local session. That
okay. Question. If I also have authentication for using a random API, Joe's API or something,
right?
I might also want to forward that information, or is that not correct? No, that's not correct because I don't need to do it. The only reason I don't need to do it is that for the cloud is because of Cloud Connect. Because normally I would have used Cloud Connect to get that connection.
Wait, what? Not to some random API. You use
no. I'm saying I'm correcting myself.
A cloud API.
Right. What I'm saying.
Right.
No, I'm correcting myself. Here's what I'm saying. I was thinking. So if I call an API with URL read or something, okay?
Yeah.
Then I have to be responsible for the authentication within the URL read command, basically.
That's not entirely true. It might be true for URL read. I believe URL execute will, if it is a Wolfram cloud URL, it will automatically inject the authentication.
Okay, fine. But for our cloud, it does that. Now, what's coming is the system services mechanism, right? Which gives you authentication for many system services. So, for example,
what is a system? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so for example, our satellite image provider. Okay.
Yeah.
Somewhere deep inside the system, there is authentication for the satellite image provider. Okay. If you want to download gazillions of satellite images, you can get a separate account with them, which you can then pass through our system to allow you to then download gazillions of satellite images. Okay.
How does this differ from a service connection?
Because these are things which they are integrated services. Some of them are deeply integrated, things you didn't know were external.
Okay, fine. That makes sense.
Okay. So, but those deeply integrated things will allow one to, like you're doing here for the cloud, you could have something which is preset as, this is my account for the satellite image provider. Now, every time you use GeoImage, it will use that. See what I'm saying?
Okay.
Unlike URL execute, where normally if you're going to an external API, you have to give the authentication right there. Right. So it's a way of presetting. So what I'm arguing is that this credentials thing there's a generalization of this, which is forwarding system credentials.
Okay, but do system credentials currently exist?
No.
Okay.
Except in the form of, the only thing they exist in, system services have credentials, and that mechanism does not yet exist. But the concept of a system credential is yet something different. It's a keychain credential.
Right. Well, right now I'm only able to forward what exists, which is cloud credentials, and this seemed, at least at the time, to be the most reasonable way to do that. If you have a suggestion for designing in anticipation of a generalization existing,
well, that's what I'm thinking.
Open to that.
I'm thinking about. I would just say forward credentials.
And what does it look like? Is it true or false? Yeah, I guess. Okay.
Yeah. True means forward the credentials you have.
Okay. How do we?
No, I'm not.
How do we
sure
make it?
Right. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
right.
How do we make it clear what credentials are being forwarded? Because right now it's only cloud credentials. It's not service connections. It's not anything else. Could always use
I
this
might be
option
happier with a name like cloud credentials forwarding, arrow true or false.
Well, okay, then that's a noun phrase, and it doesn't mesh with like include definitions, which is for.
All right. Okay.
I mean, it's, do I forward cloud credentials or not? Yes or no.
All right. Okay. Fine. I agree.
Okay. So job input files, that should probably be batch job input files or remote batch job input files. Not sure which, but it should have a prefix to it.
I think it should be remote batch job input files.
Okay, sure.
Why is that an option? Why is that not part of some association which has all kinds of configuration information for the job? In other words,
that would be that's provider settings. Provider settings is an association that has optional association that has configuration stuff for the job, but provider settings is all of the pieces of the configuration values that are.
That thing has to be called remote batch job provider settings.
You're right. It should be. But that is an association of options that are specific to a submission provider. Job input files will work on as many submission providers as will support it. Which
okay.
I hope to be
all right. Okay.
But these
fine.
options appear inside remote batch submit, right?
Correct.
So I don't see why they should repeat the whole name there. I mean, they are kind of scoped by where they appear.
Yeah, but we've tried to avoid that because
I mean, my screen isn't wide enough for all of these names, right? I mean,
knowing you, Roman, I'm sure you have a very big screen. But
I have a very wide screen. Yes.
I think the fact that we currently have no plans to call anything else a job ever, because whenever this remote submit comes along, it will return task objects.
Listen, I think we should defensively name these things. If they can be generalized later, then we can generalize them later. I think we should add all these prefixes. I know they're ugly.
Okay. So we have just for my to clarify, we have remote batch remote batch job input files, and then should it be remote submission provider settings or remote job provider settings?
Oh boy. Look, I think we could probably get away with remote provider settings, because I think that we may be able to reuse that option for some other things.
Okay, as long as we can guarantee that it will always be an association, which I think is reasonable.
It will be.
Okay, so remote batch job input files and remote provider settings.
Why don't we just call it remote input files? And then we can reuse that for lots of other things.
Okay, sure. Again, if we expect that it will always be an association of either of strings to file names or strings to external storage objects.
I think this will be fine. I mean, so that would be remote input files. And this would be remote provider settings.
Okay, I think that makes sense. And now there are some limitations with job input files that won't necessarily be limitations for other uses of that.
Don't worry about it.
Okay. Okay. Can you just or if you have something you want to say, that's
no.
But those visualizations again they will go to design, but I just want approval of the concept.
That's cool. But I mean, yes. I mean, this is. What the heck is this? What is this? Oh, this is for the array jobs.
Yes, each cell is a child job of the array job.
Boy, this is complicated.
It's also very helpful, very useful. But
sure is. Yes.
But I mean, there isn't.
So wait a minute. So this question about a UI. This is more relevant. The UI is relevant for array jobs. It's not so relevant for single batch jobs, is it? Or is it? I mean, because it's a single batch job, it's like I'm running my Turing machine. I have no idea when it will halt.
Right. In a single batch job, the only data that you can get between the time of it hits the running stage and it hits the succeeded or failed stage, the only data that changes is the log and any side effects that you program into it manually. While for an array job, there's stuff happening between the submission of the whole array job and the completion of or failure of the whole array job, which is that the child jobs are succeeding or failing as they go along. So, and this does not persist across because it is dynamic and it requires cloud stuff to happen. It does not. It requires network stuff to happen. It does not persist across sessions. So
why can't it rehydrate?
Because it might have spawned into a session that does not have authentication information. That has.
Well, but if it does have authentication information, why not let it work?
It doesn't. It does. Okay, it's possible, but the authentication information might exist, but might not be the same. It might be for a different cloud account, different AWS account, and then it has to do a network request. I'm very wary of having any dynamic thing that automatically does a network request as soon as it appears, because then you end up with issues like if your network's down, it might hang forever and block the
but there's no security issue, is there?
There's no security issue.
But we have timeouts, and I really think it should rehydrate if it can. I mean, It doesn't need to be there for V1, but I think it should rehydrate if it can.
Okay.
Okay, there's a question from Brian about elision if there are hundreds of entries in the array. I mean, clearly you should just get rid of the mesh if it gets too big, or you'll only see the mesh? I'm sure
really?
you've got.
I don't think you'll always see the. I mean, I don't think you'll only see the mesh. If you, I mean, the example
How many
there
jobs?
is with
Yeah.
maximum you can have on AWS batch is 10,000.
Okay.
Sorry, 9,999.
Okay, but so it's 100 across, so it's no big deal.
Right.
Okay. So the answer is there won't be a problem just because of limitations on AWS.
Yeah.
But you might as well put into the code something which, if it gets to be 1,000 across, we have 1 million jobs in some future, cloud provider.
Well, it's an array plot. Shouldn't array plot do that automatically? Well, I guess
no, it doesn't.
Since
If
mesh
you set
is,
mesh
yeah, if you set okay. Okay.
Okay. So now Ethan is saying most people don't have personal AWS infrastructure, but rather have multiple AWS accounts that connect with multi-factor authentication into a jump host, secured VPNs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do we know if that all works?
Right. There is no SSH never comes into play here. The job submission is happening via the AWS API, which you can access as long as you have authentication information for your AWS account, and your credentials have the right permissions.
That information through multi-factor, stuff and so on, but then you basically copy paste that into that.
No, it does not go into there. In fact, this has changed since the last time you saw it, or rather, this has been added. It's now powered by a service connection, the AWS client. It's just called AWS, the AWS service connection, which on your, if you want to try it, you can try it. Run the initialization there.
I need to go soon, but that's all right. I want to just try something.
Yeah. That'll take a minute though, because it has to install. Not a minute, but little while because it has to install some packets.
What the heck is all of
this? It's just installing packets.
Okay, but then what do I do? Then
you'll run that next bit there. That's remote submission environment object. And since it's the first time you're doing it, it will pop up a service connection dialog. Okay, looks like you can go ahead.
Okay, so now I run this. Oh, exciting.
Okay, so you can check the automatic and manual just so you can see the difference. With automatic, you specify a profile name, which is there's a well-defined location that you can put a file in your home directory that lists potentially multiple sets of credentials and has
cool.
a name for each.
This is very nice.
Thank you. And then for manual, you're specifying your credentials, access key and access.
So can you get this stuff from your system keychain?
Well, you can't get it from the system keychain because no one stores it there. Like the AWS CLI doesn't use the keychain. Could we put it in the system keychain? Yes, but that's really dependent on the larger service connection system supporting the keychain, which it doesn't right now because it predates it.
So if the service connection supported the keychain, you could potentially store the stuff in your keychain and not have to fill it in.
Right. Yes, correct. Well, it also stores it using the existing mechanism for saving service connections, which is some combination of a local file somewhere and also some cloud thing that I don't really know how.
Okay, so Ethan is commenting. I'm not sure what the right but refers to. Switch based on environment variables based on the AWS command line. You can change the credentials.
Right. You cannot. It does not look at the environment variable. It probably should. So yes, and I don't think there's any reason it couldn't do that.
Look at what environment variable? The AWS environment variable?
It's like, yes, it's something like AWS_profile. That's what the AWS CLI will look at that.
So wait a minute. Profile is a name. What is that?
A name that is in in your /AWS/credentials file. So you can have the default one that it says there is default. It should. Right now you have to type default in. That's a bug that has to do with
the word default like this or what?
Yes, you have to type that in. And that will it's a bug that it doesn't use that by default. But so I think
happening.
So it uses your credentials that are in that file. Roger has set those up for you, so it should.
So I can actually do this.
Yes, should be able to.
So you mean I can actually run a job on AWS? That's
Yeah,
exciting.
try it.
Submitting to provider. Cool.
So you can check the status. That should, I think I have the.
Okay, so if I say job evaluation data, it says not missing, not available.
Right. Yeah,
You know,
I think
it should say missing job not or something. It should
actually it is. I intend to have it be missing, not available, and then the second argument is status goes to whatever the current job status is.
Okay.
So it would say status go or job status perhaps goes to running. So I intend to have that in there.
This is very cool. How long is it going to take?
About a minute and a half, because it looks like it's not using a warm instance. There are a couple different states that it can be in that affect how long a job takes to run. But I'm watching it on my end, and it's still in the starting state.
Okay. But so I see. So it didn't have a warm instance because I haven't provisioned those instances, or because what?
Well, actually, it did have a warm instance because I configured it before this meeting to have a warm to keep an instance running. But I think it doesn't have the image, the container image cached on that instance. So if the best case scenario, in the best case scenario on AWS, it's about 10 or 15 seconds before it launches between remote submit, you evaluating that, and it actually launching into your job code on the instance.
So let me just ask you a really practical question, because I might actually use this today.
Sure.
I'd like to. The instance you have configured for me, is it a reasonably juicy machine?
Well, it uses however many vCPUs you request. Right now, you only requested one because that's the default, but you can set in the provider settings option, you can say vCPU count goes to any integer from 1 to 96, and it will launch an instance based on that.
So when so you're saying if I said remote submit here, and I were to say instead of that, I would say remote submit, and then I would say provider settings, arrow,
right. Association.
Yep.
And then vCPU count string.
What's vCPU?
Virtual CPU.
Okay.
That's standard terminology.
Okay,
right.
So if I say 96, then
right,
then
and yes, and your job is done, by the way.
Okay. Okay. Ta-da.
And I suspect if you submit a job again, if you submit that same one again, it will finish much quicker.
All right. That's impressed me.
Wait, hold on. Tell me how many vCPUs you're going to use, because right now the instance it's running only has 16.
I'm going to use. I'll use 16.
Okay, that should work.
Okay. So now what I want to say is parallel table.
You could say 96. It would just take like 6 minutes because it has to launch up the new instance with more vCPUs. Right. It's just the configuration that I've set up is I just have shortcuts on the AWS side to keep stuff running.
Submitting that. Then I've got a new job there.
Right.
But I didn't call that.
Yep.
Let me call that job 2.
And it started running.
Okay. So hold on. Let me look at job 1. The job log of job 1.
Right.
Oh, I see. It had to make a request to get that job log.
Yes. Okay. The new job is
job
done.
1 has that.
The second job is done now. But it's
so if I say job 2. Coolosaurus. Okay, so now here, just for fun, I want to do.
That's going to be the same, because it's only running on one machine.
I understand.
Okay, fine.
Okay, let me just. Okay, so then eventually I'm going to have job 3. So let's look at job 2 job log. Okay, not very exciting. Oh, why did it say launching? Oh, I see. That was a message from my...
It's effectively from your code because it happened after it started your code and before your code finished. And job 3 is done now, by the way.
Okay, so now let's say job 3. Cool. Cool. Really ran in parallel. Very nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not lying to you. It runs in parallel. That's
very nice. Okay, so one thing here that would really hang me up we are going to need to tag these things, because if I had code that had an echo in it, but then it had this launching kernels thing, and I have parsing code that deals with this, it's just going to go bonkers.
If you really want structured data from your job code, you should be gathering that yourself.
Okay, it's an interesting claim. Okay, okay. It's like new progress monitor unification. You should think about having a unified GUI to make, I mean, we just don't have that many logging things here. I mean, that is another, it's a good project to have some kind of unified logging framework. We don't have that yet. Okay, Ethan is saying the job object should have a hyperlink to print the progress panel.
Just like inserting a new cell? Or wait, what's the progress panel? Is that the dynamic status visualization, which is only exists for array jobs?
What about going to your Amazon, whatever you're looking at, Jesse? Why doesn't this remote job object have a link to that thing?
Right. The thing that I'm looking at is just a generic dashboard. It's not specific to that job. It's just
it doesn't have a deep linking URL that will pull up the dashboard for that job.
There is a dashboard for that job, but it's actually less useful than the main one. I'm putting in the Rocket Chat channel just so you can see what I'm looking at.
Can I pull this up on the main screen?
Yeah, you're welcome to. So what I was just looking at is the first row of that job queues list that shows me the number of jobs in each state. And now I can also show you what an individual jobs thing looks like, which is, I find, not as useful.
So if you can deep link to this, that would be a useful thing to have.
Okay, this is not a deep link because it doesn't have the job thing in it. The URL is like whatever.
But even just having a link to your generic, how to see what's going on.
Okay, I think that makes sense.
Okay. Okay. Oh boy, I am just Oh, I see. Ethan is saying the progress panel doesn't exist yet. Right. But that's a separate thing to have a link in that. All right, listen, I think we've this is really nice. I mean, this is really, this is very cool. Very cool. In fact, I'm going to use it today. So let's hope that my Amazon account is appropriately fueled.
Okay, let me know so I can set the max number of vCPUs appropriately.
Okay, well, don't waste money having them.
I won't.
Okay, all right, good work. Okay, I think we're pretty much done here. Let's get this out. Oh, Ethan is saying a suggestion for making a panel for polling collecting console print instead of many cell prints. I agree that that's a useful thing. Can we get that on the ILD agenda logging framework that collects cell prints and things?
I'll let them know.
Okay, great stuff, guys.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, will you send this notebook to me because it has the name changes? And
Carla can send it. She's about to rename that section.
Yes, will do.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Carla, could you send me mail telling me where you put it when it's moved?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, guys. Good stuff. And thank you, folks on the live stream. Very useful comments. Much appreciated. All right.
Yeah,
See you
thank
guys soon. Okay. Bye.
Bye.